Skagway has always been the connection to Canada, to the Yukon, and to the northern part of BC specifically. We're geographically linked. We're probably the only community in Alaska, only small community in Alaska that has every mode of transportation available to it: water, air, land, and rail. And that has been and will continue to be Skagway's unique transportation function for years to come.
Today, we can travel comfortably, safely, and efficiently to and through Skagway. The travel luxuries we enjoy evolved from many years of tragedies and obstacles endured and overcome throughout the history of Skagway's transportation corridor.
The thousands who fall and vanish in the wilderness like raindrops in the sea are seldom noticed.
Skagway is the northernmost community in Alaska's southeastern panhandle. Surrounded by islands, mountains, and glaciers, it is one of few Southeast Alaska towns accessible by road, and the only one with a railroad. Skagway's location and the need for moving people and materials between the northwest coast and the interior has been a determining factor in the strength of the community throughout its history.
Now, my dad remembers Skagway Valley when the trees grew right down to the beach before Captain Moore even built his log cabin.
Long before the first Europeans arrived, northern Southeast Alaska belonged to the Klondike. They had many permanent villages and seasonal subsistence camps throughout the region. The Klondike also established and controlled trails and passageways leading up rivers and over mountain passes to the interior. These routes were conduits for bartering and conducting business with inland tribes. Eventually, prospectors took over these trails and built new ones to gold fields in the Yukon. Many natives continued to make a living along these passageways by transporting materials for prospectors during the gold rush.
My grandfather used to talk about that hard work, because the more you could carry, the more you made. Now, as far as how much they made, I don't know. But he said it was extremely hard work going up the pass, carrying as much as you thought you could carry and still make it.
It was gold that brought the first white settlers to northern Southeast Alaska. In 1887, prospector George Holt became the first known non-native to cross the Chilkoot Trail. Just 7 years later, the Dyea Flats became a trading post to outfit miners and packers heading over the Chilkoot Trail to the Yukon. Also in 1887, during a boundary survey expedition, Klondike guide Skookum Jim led Captain William Moore through another pass. Moore measured the trail at 18 zigzagging roller coaster miles from tidewater to summit. The trail was named White Pass after a Canadian government minister who backed the survey.
I fully expect before many years to see a pack trail through this pass, followed by a wagon road. And I would not be at all surprised to see a railroad through to the lakes.
Moore's speculations prompted him and his son to establish a homestead and town site in the valley below the pass. It soon became the city of Skagway, gateway to the Klondike goldfields.
The steamer Portland arrived in Seattle with 68 miners from the Klondike and $1 million worth of gold. Most of the miners who came back rich were wandering prospectors with no capital but their picks and scanty rations. They picked up gold as a farmer picks up potatoes.
6 days after the gold arrived in Seattle, the steamship Queen cast off, bulging with eager prospectors heading to Dyea. However, Moore persuaded them to land in Skagway. This was the beginning of Skagway's development as an important port and transportation corridor. Skagway soon swelled to a town of 10,000 people. They came from around the world, all hoping to fill their pokes with potato-sized nuggets. They used whatever they could to haul tons of supplies over the rugged passes. Horses, mules, and dog sleds were common. Goats, oxen, and cows were also used, along with bicycles and other wheeled inventions. In 1897, some 5,000 people started over the White Pass, but only 1 in 10 ever completed the journey.
This trail, its winding in and out, leaves one's mind in serious doubt whether the man who planned this route was going to hell or coming out.
Both the White Pass and the Chilkoot Trail presented formidable odds. Fierce weather conditions, epidemics, suicides, murders, robberies, and con men were all part of the journey to the Klondike. The pack animals suffered too.
It is a trail of blood, for the poor animals are falling over the bluffs, getting tangled between the rocks and breaking their legs and backs. The trail in a few days will be impassable, for the stench from the carcasses is sickening. Every day we see strong men coming back with tears running down their cheeks, completely broken down, and the stream of humanity passes on, paying no heed to their suffering.
The profits in moving miners north created fierce competition between Skagway and Dyea. During the early years of the gold rush, most prospectors preferred Dyea and the Chilkoot Trail to Skagway and the White Pass route. Then, during the spring of '98, the steep, snow-covered slopes of the Chilkoot became deadly, turning traffic to Skagway and the White Pass.
All of a sudden, I heard a loud yelling and instantly began to feel myself falling down the hill, and looked around and saw many others suddenly falling down, some with their feet in the air and their heads buried out of sight in the snow. Then I realized we were in an avalanche.
Former Minneapolis Mayor George Brackett established the first wagon road to the White Pass summit in the fall of 1897. Brackett charged a toll for his road on the 12-mile stretch between Skagway and White Pass City. On the Chilkoot Trail, 4 companies constructed tramways and charged prospectors for each pound of cargo hauled. The tramways, toll roads, and wild inventions for moving people and cargo to the Klondike were clearly inadequate. The overwhelming number of people and endless tragedies emphasized the need for better means of transportation. Several Alaskan and Canadian companies were competing for backers to construct a railroad to the Yukon. A young Irish-Canadian railway construction expert, Michael Haney, made it happen. He hiked the 40 miles from Bennett to Skagway, making detailed notes. Haney was convinced that the White Pass route could handle a railroad. Upon returning to Skagway, he fell into the company of wealthy British investors and soon had their handshakes on a deal to back the railroad project. The White Pass and Yukon Railroad Company formed, and construction of the $10 million narrow-gauge railroad began in May 1898. Within 2 months, 4 miles of track had been laid, and passengers were already riding the rails. By August, ticket sales were helping to offset construction costs.
The 150 people, including Skagway residents, were in flat cars as the train steamed up Broadway and crossed the trestle to the west side of Skagway River. The trip ended at Rocky Point, where they had a sumptuous lunch hosted by Big Mike.
Edith Lee was born in Skagway. Her parents arrived just before the turn of the century to work on Big Mike Haney's railroad.
And at this time, all the talk was Alaska, Alaska, and my dad got in contact with someone that was doing hiring in Alaska. And he collected 125 men and to get a contract to work on the railroad. So they left Seattle, I think on Christmas Day, and arrived in Skagway around the last day of 98 or the first day of 99 with his 125 men. And my mother, of course, who was 7 months pregnant, and they had no previous arrangements of where they were going to live or how they were going to live or anything.
By July 1899, the worst part of the route was conquered. The Iron Horse could carry prospectors and gear all the way to the shores of Lake Bennett.
Last spike driven in at Bennett City. Haney had his teams comprising 150 horses lined up in procession. The steamers blew their whistles and 21 earth-quaking blasts were shot, the most thrilling and eventful scene ever witnessed north of Puget Sound.
In 1900, the final tracks were laid to Whitehorse. After 26 months of back-breaking work, there were a total of 516 curves, 71 bridges and culverts, and a 250-foot tunnel. At the time, the bridge over Dead Horse Gulch was the highest cantilever railroad bridge in the world, standing 215 feet high. With the railroad in place and the gold rush waning, Dyea soon became a ghost town, and the Chilkoot Trail merely a tourist attraction. In 1901, the White Pass and Yukon Railroad Company established a sternwheeler service on the Yukon River. By 1904, almost 12,000 passengers were riding the rails. More than 30,000 tons of freight and ore was hauled annually. The White Pass and Yukon Railroad had a virtual monopoly on transportation. This reign lasted over 50 years. At the turn of the century, Skagway had a population of 10,000. A decade later, there were only 872 residents. The gold rush was over, but the port facilities and railroad remained. Skagway was still an important passenger and freight route to Whitehorse. The railroad kept Skagway from becoming a ghost town by providing jobs for many in the community.
My dad was the engineer, and I'd go with him, and I thought it was great. You know, he'd stick me out the window, and I'd wave to everybody as they went along, you know.
During the summer, many passengers on the railroad were tourists. This trend that began with the first excursion in 1898 would play an important role in Skagway's economy throughout the coming years.
Summer tourists come to Skagway. They ride the railroad and are enchanted. They see nuggets and could say nothing too good of this lovely city and the wealth of gold back of it.
The Skagway of today is an orderly community. It has good schools, waterworks and sewers, electric lights, telephones, a daily newspaper, and several churches. The chief business is selling of curios to the tourists. There are half a dozen stores that sell jewelry, carvings, moccasins, and baskets.
Mother started making moccasins and selling moccasins, and she did this for several years. And they would go uptown when the tourist boat started and sell right on the streets in town.
By the 1920s, cruise ships were a common sight along the Skagway waterfront. Visitors could tour the town and take a round-trip lunch excursion to Lake Bennett on the train. Barbara Callan's mother had a photo finishing shop. Most of the business came from cruise ship visitors.
We would go down in the morning when the ship came in and get these rolls of film and bring them back up, and then my mother would spend the whole day developing and printing these pictures. And then we'd take them back down to the ship before it sailed. It would be nice and still. The orchestra would be playing, the ship would glide away. It was just like a magical moment.
Work on the local airfield, which was begun a fortnight ago, is progressing rapidly, and the center of the field is being whipped into first-class shape.
During the mid-30s, aviation descended into Skagway. The White Pass Railroad created White Pass Airways. Soon they and other carriers were flying mail, freight, tourists, and prospectors. The Depression was a serious blow to Skagway's tourism and cargo service industry. The market crash of '29 created a drastic drop in ship and rail traffic. Skagway's railroad employees were either laid off or asked to take a cut in pay. The tourist traffic fell off nearly 45% by 1933. But within 2 years, tourism would help Skagway's economy recover.
Mr. Blanchard, traveling agent for the White Pass and Yukon Railroad, said it was impossible to state exactly how many people will be making the trip this summer, but it will undoubtedly be a good tourist year.
The 1935 season broke all previous records. 3 companies and 11 cruise ships made regular stops in Skagway. Tourism remained a vital part of Skagway's economy and transportation industry until World War II. During the war, the military declared Alaska off limits to tourists. Skagway was caught by surprise in other ways. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. 4 months later, thousands of soldiers invaded Skagway.
One morning we went out and looked out, and here these thousands of soldiers were marching up the street. Nobody had any idea they were coming. It was absolutely a total surprise to us.
The Japanese also invaded Alaska's Aleutian Islands. To secure a defense, the military needed a highway for moving soldiers and war materials to and across Alaska. So they stepped up their plans to build the Alaska and Canadian, or Alcan, Highway. Skagway's deep, ice-free port and railroad route to the interior lured the military. They soon took over Skagway's train and steamship fleets for transporting materials and troops inland to build the Alcan.
Well, I was in the service. I went in the ACS Signal Corps. We were supposed to go overseas. Instead of that, they sent us up on the Alcan Highway. So they sent me right through Skagway. We all marched up the dock. Okay. And then as soon as we hit town, we had several hours before the train pulled out to take us to Carcross, where we started at the Alcan Highway. I was so glad to be home. My family's so glad to see me, because I was amongst thousands of GIs, you know, and here I'm a GI, born and raised here, you know.
Skagway experienced a boom similar to the gold rush. Thousands of people and tons of materials came through town headed to the interior.
It was amazing. They were all over town. Every place there was a vacant spot, they put up a barracks, a tent, and so forth and so on. And our little town of 800 people was completely swamped with soldiers.
They were to fight the elements as man had since the days of '98. It was 110 miles of single track to a railroader's hell. There was tonnage to move, and with GIs at the throttle, trains began to roll over the narrow ribbons of steel at an ever-increasing pace.
Before the war, the railroad averaged 25,000 tons of freight a year. The military hauled 282,000 tons of freight in less than a year to construct the road and defense outposts. Building the highway in the midst of the harsh Alaska wilderness was not an easy job.
In the summertime, it was mud and mosquitoes, and the trucks were stuck, and the bulldozers were stuck. It was glacier mud, You know, this glacier mud is real thick, and it just absorbs it like a cat, a big D8 cat, you know, building the road. One of them we had to leave up there because it sunk right into the mud and everything, and they couldn't get it out, and they just built right over the top of it. That winter, 72 below, living in tents, boy, I tell you, it was, we even hated to go outside to do anything. You'd work in pairs, and each guy would watch the other guy. If he started getting white in his ears and everything, and a lot of frozen hands, frozen feet, and everything else.
The Alcan Highway officially opened in November of 1942 after just 8 months of construction. It stretched 1,500 miles from Dawson Creek to Fairbanks. Near the end of the war, the troops pulled out of Skagway. But the new highway increased the railroad's load of freight and petroleum products. Then in the 1960s, the White Pass and Yukon Railroad got another boost with a flurry of mining development in the Yukon. To keep up with the increase in traffic, the railroad began a program of modernization. Loading docks were expanded, and a fleet of 50 trucks was purchased to haul ore from the mines to Whitehorse. The railroad also pioneered the use of containerized freight, the system now used worldwide.
Containers were loaded in Vancouver, put on a vessel, brought to Skagway, put on a train, transported over to Whitehorse on the railway. From there, the container would be put on a truck and taken to somewhere in the Yukon. So you had a container that was, the seal was never broken from the time it left Vancouver until the time it was unloaded at a mine site somewhere in the Yukon. White Pass pioneered that. It's a proud part of White Pass's history.
The railroad provided transportation to the interior and jobs. However, a growing number of people wanted a road connecting Skagway with the Alcan. In the early 60s, a group of volunteers started the project. Then, in the mid-70s, federal and state funds were granted to construct the Klondike Highway. It took 4 years and $1 million a mile to blast a route up the steep 11.5 miles of rock from Skagway to the White Pass summit. The highway was completed in 1978. 4 years later, the railroad was running into problems.
Every pound of ore haul stopped, and the inbound general cargo fell to just a trickle. I mean, the world simply stopped turning for the Yukon Territory and for White Pass, and the railway closed on October 8, 1982.
The White Pass and Yukon Railroad lost more than 70% of its traffic and revenue when the mines in the Yukon closed. The railroad shutdown forced many Skagway residents to leave town.
I think we were all in some sort of a state of shock, because I mean, here was this little railroad that had started in 1898 and had gone through tough times, you know, in the teens, in the 20s, and made it through the Depression, made it through World War II, made it through after World War II, and here we are in 1982, and the thing is shut down.
Skagway's economy held on over the next few years with tourism. Rebounding mineral prices in 1986 allowed mines in the Yukon to reopen, but the White Pass lost the ore hauling contract to Linden Transport. Linden began trucking the ore between the Yukon and the port of Skagway on a year-round basis. In a short time, the highway became the main transportation route to the Yukon, hauling cargo and ore. By 1988, Skagway's annual tourist numbers had increased significantly since the railroad closure. The increase enabled the trains to roll again. The eventful day took place on March 2nd, 1988.
The day we made the inaugural run, that was a great day. I wish that day would never end. It was just a wonderful feeling.
The train is now exclusively a summer tourist operation, providing service from Skagway to Lake Bennett. The tourism industry in southeast Alaska and the Yukon continues to grow. Over 80,000 visitors use the highway each year, many connecting with the Alaska Ferry. Much like the railroad had been, the Klondike Highway is now a lifeline for Skagway and its Yukon neighbors.
Skagway has been dealt many adverse situations over its history in terms of transportation into and out of Skagway. Going back in the days of the gold rush. And yet we continue to put forth our best efforts to ensure that Skagway will always be able to be visited and used as a port of commerce forever. And I think our track record as a community, as a people that can work together to accomplish things, is astounding. It's truly amazing how Skagway has gotten to be the tourist and transportation destination that it is today.